First of all, I want to thank you for coming, and I want you to be very aware that I know most of the folks in the room this morning are not elected officials. They're public servants who've chosen, at least for this stage of your career, maybe for your whole career, to serve the public by being someone who is a staff to a city. I've talked to folks from a variety of different cities, and one of the best things I think that we've experienced about this program is it's been valuable whether a person is an elected official or is serving staff, whether they are a frontline person or in the back room. A lot of people have talked to us about how this experience of talking about budget as message has helped them do their job. I also like to make sure people kind of know how I ended up here, because not that there's anything wrong with being a professor. It's a great thing that you actually do every day, things that we might teach in the classroom, but it's not the same as doing a career. So I did have the privilege of serving for 8 years as a member of Tampa's City Council. In 1991, when I decided to run, it was at the very last minute. The seat opened up. It was the seat that was where I lived. I was teaching at the University of South Florida at the time, and one of the political activists was a student in my class, and he came to me and said, "Did you hear the seat's open?" Well, who's running? And we talked about the people who were running. We weren't really thrilled about any of them. And so we're saying, okay, what are we going to do about this? And I said, Bill, what would you think if I ran? Oh, that would be so cool, Dr. Payne. So I went home, talked to my wife, paid the filing fee, and ran. There were 5 candidates in that primary runoff system. I had been a political consultant for some time. I understood what it would take to win. I wanted 23-24% in the primary, because if I had that, I knew I would win the runoff because I would know where my voters were. And I came in at like 23.5%. So that was good. And in the runoff, I won with something like 63% of the vote. So I'm a city councilman. But I'm also a university professor, so I know what I'm doing, right? And it took me 2 years to figure out that I knew nothing about what I was doing in public office, and then another 2 years to begin to figure it out. Fortunately, my citizens voted me back into office in 1995. I did never have the privilege of running without opposition, because I don't know when to keep my mouth shut. That's part of what being a professor is all about too, I suppose. So in 1999, Tampa has term limits. So in 1999, I knew that if I wanted to continue to do the work that I was doing, I would have to run citywide. I could no longer run in my district. So I chose to do that. And I drew as my opponent, I was a carpetbagger. I moved to Tampa in 1988, got elected in 91. So pretty unusual way for a municipal official to get into office. In 1999, when I run citywide, I draw as my opponent a 4th-generation Tampania, whose grandfather's bakery is a state historic landmark in Ybor City, and who is a millionaire. Not good planning on my part. Rose spent $125,000 on that race for city council, $50,000 of her own money. I raised $63,000 because I didn't have $5,000 to put into my own account. So I was outspent 2-to-1. And it was tough. The whole campaign, it was back and forth. Whatever data we had told us it was going to be very close. So I don't know if you've been involved in the campaign part of these things. On election day, the candidates always show up at polling places and they shake people's hands. In part because that may get them 3 or 4 new votes, and that helps. That's how you get elected sometimes. And in part because that's how you support your volunteers. And in part to kind of pump yourself up for the victory party that you hope will be a victory party. So I chose in that last hour to be in a very large precinct in South Tampa, not part of my district, but an area that I knew was going to come out strong for me in the citywide election because I had understood their issues and I'd been a real champion. So I'm shaking hands and all these people, I voted for you, great to see you, Scott, thanks, wish you best luck, it was great. There was also a woman there holding a sign for my opponent, Rose Ferlita, with a respectful distance, of course. During a lull in the traffic, she goes and puts the sign in the shrubs. And she comes over to me and she says, you are Scott Payne, aren't you? Now this could be good news, or this could be bad news. I said, yes, I am. And for the next 2 minutes, I wished that I had had an audio recorder. Because if I had, I could have edited what she said, and it would have made the best 30-second radio spot I ever heard about me or most anybody ever in public office. She talked about what an extraordinary public servant I'd been, how well I'd served the entire city, not just my district, what great work I did, how smart I was, how devoted I was, how caring I was. Some of you are old enough to have seen it originally, and some of you have seen it on Nick at Night. The theme song goes like this. Na 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 na. It's called The Twilight Zone. And I had entered into the Twilight Zone. Here's this volunteer for my opponent raising me to the skies. So I blush. She finishes, and I feel, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I said, can I ask you a question? Sure. Why are you working for my opponent? And she said, oh, well, you know, and then it was this social connection and that club they'd worked on together and they'd known each other. You know, the way municipal politics works, it's all about who you know and what you've done with them and which clubs and all that stuff. They'd known each other forever. And then she said, besides, I figured, what difference will one vote make? When the votes were counted on election night that night, over 31,000 ballots cast in that race. More ballots cast in that race than residents of most cities in Florida by a long shot. I lost by one vote. No lie. One vote. The headline in the political columnist column the next day in the Tampa Tribune was, "It's all your fault," and talking about the one vote. For 10 years after, for a few years after, my wife would be approached by people, never me, and they would ask for forgiveness because the doctor's appointment had run long, they'd been late leaving work, they'd forgotten to vote, their kids were sick, the dog was sick, apologizing to her because it was all their fault that I had lost the election. In 2009, 10 years later, ordained then as a Catholic deacon, giving my first homily in my parish, I told the story about, you know, how I had ended up being a deacon, my journey through public service, and so on. After Mass, this elderly Latino couple came up to me in tears and confessed that the reason I was not in public office was all their fault. They remembered exactly what had happened and everything that had gone wrong that day that had kept them from getting to the polls to vote for their favorite councilman, Scott Payne. And that's not about me. That's the other interesting thing about municipal service, is that because people actually know us, they don't just know TV ads, they see us at the Little League games, in the grocery store, in the beauty salon, all that kind of stuff. Both the elected officials and, you know, if you're wearing your uniform or your ID, people who work in the city, there's a different kind of connection. And that gives us both the privilege and the challenge of working very closely with people who actually probably know who we are and where we live. And that makes, I think, municipal service as important as anything we do in public service, and particularly challenging, but also particularly great opportunity. Well, so that's how I learned about the realities of municipal service, and with the thanks to the League, I've had the chance to continue to stay engaged working with the League shortly after I came out of office, and I've been doing it ever since. And I love working with you because I know, I was just writing about this for a professional journal, I know from my experience most of the folks sitting in this room, if not all, most of the folks that you work with, you work where you work and do what you do because somewhere part of this is, when I go home at the end of the day, I've made a difference that mattered. I didn't just increase the profit margin or make a big sale. I'm taking care of people, I'm meeting their needs, I'm doing what the community needs done. And that's a reward that a lot of us find particularly attractive. What we're focusing on today is something that is very hard for us to do. Nobody likes to talk about budgets because they're so hard to talk about. And I approved 8 budgets when I was on Tampa City Council as a member of council, and I remember reading through all the different spreadsheets and all the numbers and all the estimates and all the different components. And I remember that we would get an award every year from the Professional Association for how good our budget presentation was, but I knew how bad it was. It was good from the standpoint of all the appropriate information was in the appropriate places so that we met the professional standards. But anybody trying to understand what we were doing who wasn't a professional was at a loss. So this is about changing that perspective and seeing our budget not simply as spreadsheets and numbers and making sure we balance the books, as important as all that is, but as a key element through which we communicate to our citizens what the city is doing, how we're responding to their needs, and inviting them into the process so that they own the budget and they have more commitment to what we're doing in the city. I am an academic, so I always have to talk about some words and give some definition. So I'm focusing on the input side of the budget message process, the way we collect input. So let's start by talking about the budget process. And I'm going to use the language that comes right out of a best practices publication. People do public budgets. Here's what the budget process is supposed to be. Activities that encompass the development, implementation, and evaluation of a plan for the provision of services and capital assets. Okay, that's the budget. That's what we do. That's a professional definition. What is the mission of the budget process? To help decision makers make informed choices about the provision of services and capital assets, and to promote stakeholder participation in the process. My emphasis. I know in 8 years on Tampa City Council that part of it we never achieved. It was all about making good decisions, helping us make good decisions, but the public, other stakeholders, they would come in, if they came, to one of those couple of 3 budget hearings that are required to have by state law at the end of the process, and we would hear them, and in most cases not much happened. We're not really engaging the stakeholders. One of the things I think is happening around the country is that we are failing to engage our citizens in ways that give them ownership. And because we're failing to engage them in ways that give them ownership, they're not supporting a lot of what we're doing. If you've had to do a referendum for a tax and you've been successful, almost certainly what you did was you did an extensive amount of work with the public to understand what their concerns were, and you addressed that as part of what you delivered when you went up for that tax. And if you failed, there's a good chance it's because that didn't get done well. And we're seeing that all the time. We got beat up a few years ago. You remember a previous primary, and there was a tax reform measure that deformed our property tax system horribly. We lost that fight. And I believe fundamentally the reason we lost that fight was not that it was about taxes, but that it was about taxpayers. That the way the debate got framed in the press, in the public, was, as taxpayers, what do you want? Well, if you're a taxpayer, what do you want? Well, that's taxes. That's all that matters, right? The interest of a taxpayer is to pay as little tax as possible. If you are customers, what are your interests? Service at a value. So it's a price-value calculation. That's a whole different conversation, because now I'm not just thinking about what I'm spending, I'm thinking about what I'm getting. That's a better position to be in to debate that issue. Even better. If I'm a citizen, what is my interest? It's in my community. It belongs to me and everybody else, and I care about it. And that might even lead me to pay for things that don't benefit me, because I see them benefiting the larger whole. And it is clear that our citizens will do that when we engage them in ways that help them understand they're not just taxpayers. And they're not just customers. The city belongs to them. So we need to talk about how we can use the input process of budgeting to really engage the larger community in the process. So we need to talk about stakeholders. In dictionaries you're not supposed to do this, but what's a stakeholder? Anyone affected by or who has a stake, a stake in the government. So anybody. Well, so who are our stakeholders? Citizens. Okay, so we start the citizens of the city.
Business owners.
Business owners, whether they live there or not, right? Business owners. Who else is a stakeholder?
Employees.
Sorry? Police? Employees, right, thank you. Right. Police, fire, staff, whatever department. So the employees are a stakeholder. And the unions, which are an interest group representing employees, are a stakeholder. So that's distinct, right? Not necessarily the same always. Who else? Elected officials are stakeholders, absolutely.
Bondholders.
Bondholders, good point. Because many of us have bonded our revenue streams of one kind or another to accelerate capital projects, especially. The bondholders care. Just think about, was it Stockton, California that just declared bankruptcy? They care. They're definitely a stakeholder in the city and its budget. Who else?
Vendors.
Vendors, so the people who work with you, who provide services. Yep, they are stakeholders because they want to be paid, because they're interested in what opportunities they're getting. Sure. Who else? Developers, right. People who might be making an investment in the future or have made an investment in the city, building, land, they're a stakeholder. Who else?
Strategic partners.
Right, like, give me an example.
Like the county and the city.
Thank you. So other governments with whom we have interactions, either strategically or just because it happens that way we have to work together, whether we get along well with them or not. County, cities, water management district, school board, I mean, all of these other governmental entities potentially are stakeholders in what we do. Who else?
Kind of goes along that line of utilities as well.
Utilities, okay. Depending on, like the telecom industry, we deal with them, those kinds of things. So yeah, they're stakeholders too, and how we regulate, how we manage our right-of-way, they're stakeholders.
If you provide your own services, it might be customers that are not citizens.
Thank you.
That are customers.
Right, so not only our citizens, but customers for services we provide, whether that's water, sewer, electric, whatever we're doing. They're stakeholders. Who else? Other organizations in the community, associations, nonprofit organizations that provide services, or simply our membership groups. They're stakeholders. If you have a rec center or a community center like this beautiful center, those folks are interested in how it's designed and how it's operated because they want to be able to use it. All right? Thank you. Visitors, right. We are, right, what is it, 75 million folks will come to Florida this year, and we're at 18 million residents, so there are a heck of a lot more people visiting Florida than actually live here. The visitors clearly are stakeholders in what we do. I'll throw one other one out there, which kind of been touched, but not quite. There's a difference between a citizen of your city and a resident of your city. Think about snowbirds, who may not have may not transfer their voting powers and whatever to your city, but they actually live there. Think about folks who may be living in your city but don't have the right to vote. They're not citizens one way or another, resident aliens, illegal immigrants, whoever they might be. There are folks there too that are stakeholders. Okay, long list. And we don't always think about all of these folks and organizations as folks who have a stake in what we do and therefore ought to be involved in how we decide what we do. But clearly, these are all folks we need to be listening to. Okay. Why do we need them? Whoops. So why do we need their participation? What do we want from them?
They influence decisions.
Okay, they influence decisions how? Or what do you mean by saying that you're right? What do you mean by saying they influence decisions?
Well, they vote in the military.
Right, okay.
They have input with council.
Yeah. So whether it's the influencing council directly to make a decision or it's an election on something and they're going to vote, we need to know what they think because in the end we're going to need their support. They influence the process. Okay, good. That's correct. What else? Why else do we need their input? I'm sorry? Right, one way or another. Taxpayers, fees that they pay, they're actually paying, so kind of owe them some response because they're paying something, right? I heard over here.
Transparency in government.
I'm sorry, I'll come to you. Yes, ma'am.
I said, are we meeting the needs of our...
Yeah. How do we know if we're meeting their needs if we don't ask? Right? Told you I was a Catholic deacon. One of the things I do is I work with married couples who are struggling. And one of the first things I often talk about is how do you know that your spouse loves you? And when you ask the two separately how they get the answer to that question, they may be focused on one thing and the spouse may be focused on something else. It's, I do all this stuff around the house and it doesn't seem to make any difference. And you talk to the other spouse and say, doesn't spend any time with me. Oh, I'm not meeting your needs. Your need is time. I thought it was, fixing the screen porch. It's not. If we don't ask, how do we know what their needs are? We make assumptions and we make mistakes. Okay, so are we meeting their needs? The big one, to get their buy-in. If I'm not asking you, if I'm telling you what I'm going to do to you, rather than asking what I can do for you, you're not likely to buy in. Any of you raising teenagers? Okay, you know what I'm talking about here, right? If you tell them what you're going to do to them, nowhere. If you're listening to what they want to accomplish and figure out how to get there with them, then maybe you get some cooperation. Sometimes our citizens and residents and all these folks can act a little adolescent. It's okay. We all do that from time to time. We need them to understand what we're doing. We need them to understand that we're listening to them in order to have them buy into what we're doing. That's the biggie. So I'm going to suggest that there are 4 basic types of questions we should be asking stakeholders every single opportunity we get, because we need them participating. How are we doing? Remember former mayor of New York, Ed Koch. His thing walking down the street was, how am I doing? Great, mayor. How am I doing? Lousy, mayor. But he asked. He got the answer. How am I doing? Are we meeting your needs? Are we doing how is it looking to you? Is the city doing well or poorly? What do you need or what do you want? And those aren't the same. People may want something that they don't need, and maybe the city is in a position to provide it and it makes sense, or maybe not. And then there are things that they genuinely need, and the city may be in a position where it really needs to provide those, but we don't necessarily know what those are if we're not asking. So what do you need? What do you want? How can we do this better? One of the things, I don't know if you struggle with this in your particular city, and a lot of cities struggle with this tension between creating a particular kind of feel to the community, things like streetscape requirements and landscaping and sign ordinances, and on the other hand, the response of businesses to these things, which they'll say, you're inhibiting our business, you're making it hard for us to do what we want to do, and there's this back and forth between the desire to create a particular kind of city feel and look and the expectations of business owners and operators in our city. Well, sometimes the problem isn't that we're doing something wrong, it's that we're not doing something well. And if we actually sit down and talk about these issues and we understand that they're not necessarily opposed to all of what we're trying to do, they're opposed to the way we're doing it. How can we do it better? Many of our cities have gone through one-stop permitting processes, moving the process of getting permits and licenses from several different offices to one place. Maybe one place online. Why did we do that? Because we were hearing that that was a better way to meet the needs of people who are getting these permits. Maybe you're doing online billing because you've heard from your constituents. It's a better way for them to pay. I mean, how can we do this better? We shouldn't assume that we're the only ones who know what will make it work. Somebody else might have a better idea. And then finally, what should we expect? Because we're planning. We're thinking about the future. And there are folks in the community, like developers, who have certain plans in mind or things that they're thinking about doing. If we don't know that's coming, we can't plan effectively for it. If our community is changing in significant ways and we don't see that, we can't plan for it. But our citizens may be seeing it. Our business owners may be seeing it. The nonprofits may be seeing these changes and help us see what to expect, so that we can not only adopt a budget this year that makes sense, but we can plan for a budget out the next 5 years that will make sense for our community. So with all of our stakeholders, we should be asking them variations of these questions. An evaluative question, how am I doing? A question of desire, need and want. A question of, give me advice, how can we do this better? And a question of forward thinking or planning, what should we expect? Let's just take a moment and talk about what message those questions deliver. Because our focus is on using the budget process to communicate something. Asking questions doesn't sound like we're communicating, but we are. So when we ask, how am I doing? What we say to whoever we say that to is, you have a right to evaluate my work. We hear this about the public perceptions of elected officials, that they think elected officials are insulated, they're going to stay there as long as they want to, nobody can touch them, and they don't care and they don't listen. And in some cases that's true. In a lot of cases it's not. But when we ask, how am I doing? Say, okay, you actually do have the right to evaluate my work. And we say to them, I care what you think. You know, how am I doing is, I care about what you're thinking, so tell me how I'm doing. When we ask them, what do you need or want, we communicate that we want to serve them. That we're servants. That we're in the business of serving our community. We're not in the business of making money. That's a good thing and that's a fine thing that drives our economy. But that's not what we're doing. We're in the business of providing services. We want to serve. To do that, we need to know what they need and want. We send the message. We are here to serve you by asking what do you need or want. And we tell them, we care. We care what you think. Because we're asking you what you think. How can we do this better? We're communicating when we ask that question that we respect the knowledge and value the insight of these different stakeholders. We recognize that they may have a better idea. They may have an experience we can use. We respect them. And we indicate that we care what they think. Catching a pattern here? And when we ask them what we should expect, what we're telling them is that we want to respond. We want to know where things are going so we can be there with them, responding to the future needs. And yeah, we're telling them we care what you think. You'll hear later in the presentation this morning the importance of the message of care. That caring matters. And I think I'm going to jump the gun on my story here. Let me give you a real good illustration. It's a presidential campaign season, right? Michelle may tell another story about what recently happened. But back in 1992, when George Herbert Walker Bush was president and Governor Bill Clinton from Arkansas was running against him. The usual presidential debates, the different formats. One of those debates was in a town hall setting, kind of round. They were actually on stage in the middle on bar stools. No protection, no podium. And they had a little, like a music stand to write notes on. And the audience was all around them. Interesting format. Well, so this question was going to the president first, and the governor would get a chance to respond. This woman sitting in the front row spoke of how her husband had lost their job and the struggles that they're having economically. And basically the question was, what can you tell me to give me confidence that you're going to deal with my situation? President Bush sat on his stool and spoke of the economic challenges the country was facing and that he was concerned about those and things that they would do if he had another 4 years to do it. Governor Clinton got off his stool, walked over to that woman, talked about his own experience in childhood. His father was an alcoholic and lost work, and he had to go to work to help pay the bill, and he understood how difficult and terrifying that was and how committed he was to making that better. The actual content of those two messages wasn't really that different. What was different was how people experienced the responses. When Bill Clinton walked over and shared empathy, talked about how he understood that kind of experience because he'd felt it, you believed he cared. And that was the point. And he won largely because people felt like he cared about the economic struggles. And if you're looking at the current presidential election, that's the big challenge that Governor Romney is facing and the advantage Obama has in a very bad economy for which President Obama bears responsibility to some extent. Nonetheless, people are saying, if you're talking about who cares about my situation, more people think it's Obama. It has something to do, not with necessarily what he's done or what Romney's done, but with how they communicate that message. So,
one more quick story.
Yeah.
I was telling Scott this morning. This week, the tragic story in the news has been the Aurora shooting. And I was telling him what hit me immediately, and I think this really applies to what we're doing when we talk to citizens. Does anybody recall what President Obama said when he first found out about the shooting? Anybody recall his statement? He talked about his daughters. When I was listening to him on the radio, I thought he's exactly emulating what we talked about. He said, my daughters go to movies. And tonight, my wife and I are hugging those girls because that could have been our kids. And didn't most of us in the community have that same thought? Those of you with children or grandchildren, you thought, that could be my family. So it wasn't about whether you agree with his politics, you agree with his leadership. You said, he's a dad and he cares about his family. And so it doesn't mean that you agree with everything that person does, but you know that he's relating to me as a parent. And so when we talk about budget, it's kind of hard to think about that. But the truth is the same things. The decisions you're making about the budget impact the lives of people in your community. And if they know you care, they're going to pay more attention to what you're talking about and be more willing to engage. So I think we take those national examples and we say, how do we make those relevant to the message we're trying to get across?
One silly example, silly, but it shows how wonderful my wife is. She probably is the reason I got elected and stayed elected. There was a constituent in my district. We had a water problem. I don't know, it was a broken pipe or whatever. Anyway, the water coming out of his tap was brown. So he calls the house, because public officials were supposed to have our home numbers available to people, and I did. So he calls the house. I'm not home. My wife is. She takes the call. She's a very angry man on the phone. Oh, I need to take a shower. I just got home from work, and the water is brown. It's disgusting, and I can't get myself cleaned up. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. Well, you can come over and use our shower. No lie. First words out of her mouth. He said, what? She said, I'm really sorry about that. And the councilman's not home right now, but, where are you? And you can come over and use our shower. And he just broke up. He just broke up laughing. And look at what just happened to that relationship, that confrontation. Because my wife met him right where he was, cared about the situation more than anything else, and said, well, okay, I've got a shower and nobody's using it, come over. I care about you. And he left the conversation much more calm down. Carol had promised him, and of course she called me and we'd get on it, but none of that happened. He could have come over and have a shower. Well, then how can you be mad at someone who cares like that, right? Okay, and this process of taking input is that process of saying, this is how much I care. I want to know what you think. I want to know what you need. I want to know how I'm doing because I care about what you think. All right, let's talk about gathering input. I'm just going to ask you to give me one unique kind of input you think we can get from each of several different types of stakeholders. So let's talk about city management. Some of you are in the management level of your city. What is stakeholder input you can provide that is your unique contribution to this process as a manager? I don't mean city manager only, but I mean directors, people in supervisory roles. What's a perspective you bring that other people probably don't have?
Well, everything that needs to be funded. You've been in all the meetings, everything that you've promised, everything the commission has promised, and you can basically bring that to the table if you've worked with the commission well enough to set those goals and strategies to your finance director and to your budget officer.
Okay, so you've got the big picture of the city's commitments and its resources.
Oh, it's a global thing.
The global thing. Okay, very good. Sorry, I didn't mean to have to jump quite that far. How about the employees? Now, what's the unique contribution to this conversation that the city employees? To give you an example, there are lots of things. What's something employees are going to know, think about, feel that other people are probably going to have a handle on? Yeah.
People who actually do the work of the city know what the needs are because they're in the field every day. They hear directly from citizens and they know what equipment is needed, what repairs need to be made.
There you go. Right. They have direct interaction with citizens, residents, businesses, and so on. They're hearing from all the time. So they're collecting all that unique input because they're on the front line. And so that's one of the most important reasons. We need to treat employees as stakeholders and listen to them in the budget process because they know what's going on. How about the citizens? What's a unique contribution they can make to this conversation? Yeah, and you use the right word too. Their perception, right, Jim? The perception they have of the services. Because we may not be doing something that citizens think we are doing. Or we may be doing something citizens think we're not because they just don't know or don't understand. And if they don't understand, whose fault is that? It's ours. It's our job. If we know this, right, in education, if your students don't perform on the FCAT, whose fault is it? The teachers. Whether that's entirely fair or not, it's the way the system works, and it's the way the system works for us too. If our citizens don't get it, well then we're not doing our job. So yeah, they have perceptions that have validity in terms of the reality, something we may be missing. And also that perception, even if it's not valid, is very important information to help us understand where we need to do a job better of communicating what we're doing. How about customers? What's unique input they can give us? Unmet needs, okay. Things that they need, they expect a service that we don't provide, okay. I was going to say my favorite for them is how easy is it to get their problem solved as a customer, right? That's something we know from them. Businesses.
How it impacts them in terms of a local business paying the taxes.
Right.
And then they hear a lot of the perceptions in terms of service levels too.
Very good. So they both can tell us so this is the economic impact of what we're doing. How much is it hurting them? Is it helping them? And as you said also, they can be a frontline information source about people's experiences. The person in the barbershop hears it all. Bartender hears it all. Other governments, those strategic partnerships, what do we hear from them that we don't hear from others? Or what could we hear from them?
How we can work better together.
Yeah.
Provide greater level of service.
Yeah, if you've got a neighboring city and there's something you're trying to do and something they're trying to do, or it's the county and you're both trying to do it, is there an opportunity to do better financially? Is there an economy of scale? Is this a partnership? When I was in council, one of the things the 3 cities in Hillsborough County did is we tried to collaborate with the county and with the school board as well. So we looked for things where we could pool our purchases. Because when you have 3 large organizations buying toilet paper together, you get a better price than it's 3 smaller organizations doing it, or 3 organizations doing it separately. Just, okay, how can we partner? I'm going to mention a stakeholder that we didn't talk about and ask you what we can learn from them. It's the stakeholder we love to hate, the media. The media, particularly I'm thinking news broadly defined, they are a stakeholder too. What can we learn from them?
How to improve the message.
How to improve the message.
Use them to do that.
Yeah, they can tell us, the idea of sitting down, for some of us, and for many of you, because again, most of you are not dealing with the press all the time, some of you do. For some of us, the whole idea of sitting down and talking with the press is just terrifying. I understand that. But we make them our enemies by the way we treat them sometimes. When you start out in an adversarial approach, guess what? It's going to stay that way. But the idea of sitting down with a reporter who covers the city, or the editor or the publisher of your local paper, or whatever it is, having coffee and talking about their working relationship with the city, and maybe you find out that part of the reason you get beat up all the time is it's hard to find anyone to answer a question when they need it and they're on deadline. Okay, so who's going to be that point person? And how do you make sure is there a number they can call and they always get someone who will answer their questions, and if they can't answer their questions, promises to get back, gets the information and gets back. Makes their life easier, and that may, or may not, but it may get you a more fair shake. I always think it's much better to be talking to the press than have other people talking to the press. You can learn from it.
Scott, one other point. When you think about the media, I know we have this idea that the media is going to be unbiased. Well, we all know that's not true, right? We all have biases. And this whole discussion about input is also about what you see depends upon where you stand. And what that means is my life experiences mean that I may approach something different than Cindy's going to. Cindy may have had a different life experience. She may have had different challenges, so how she looks at something. And I think we have to remember that with reporters. And so if you have a reporter whose mom was a transit bus driver growing up, do you think she's going to have some perceptions about the city manager? Those may be great perceptions, or those may be bad perceptions. But that's going to shape who she is. We have a reporter in Tallahassee that's the city government reporter that really doesn't like pets. She doesn't have a dog, she doesn't have a cat. So if I'm going to pitch a story to her, I'm not going to go to that reporter because I know she doesn't like pets. What I'm saying is understand the experiences that you bring as an individual, and reporters are the same way. Find out, spend some time, and they say, I've heard this many times on reporters, I don't even try to understand ad valorem, millage rate, that stuff is just Greek to me. Well, do you think that's going to be conveyed in their story? So how do you, as the finance director, say, let me just do a basic kind of 101. How do we get there? What are the challenges our community faces? Half our property in Tallahassee is tax exempt. What challenges does that create for us? And let me explain how that compares to others. So sometimes that experience you're sharing with that reporter then allows you to be in a position that you can now relate to them, and it changes the outcome of their reporting because you took the time to get their input. So we're talking specifically about budget, but it's also talking about people. Because when you know their stories, you can now try to identify how does that link to the message you're trying to share with them.
Absolutely. We're not going to get the full picture from anyone. So here's what I want to kind of leave us with on the input side, and we're going to start talking about output. All the input is valuable. All of it. when I served on council for a few years, we all have gadflies, you know, people who come to council meetings for their 3 minutes of whatever, and it's painful, it's sometimes very frustrating, you feel like you're wasting your time, and they come. When I was on council for a few years, there was this gentleman who would come in frequently. He'd walk up to the podium and say, my name is the ordained of God, Reverend Floyd Irwin, and I have a message from the Lord. He was a homeless man, always came in a dirty white polyester suit, dirty white shirt, dirty white tie, his beard like this, his hair like that, and he would deliver his message from the Lord, or wherever it was coming from at the time. Some of his messages were horrible, I mean abusive, terrible, some of them were more positive. You kind of just, oh please, I want to just leave. But every now and then, if you would make yourself listen, there'd be something in what he had to say. Maybe it was once every 4 months, but there would be something, I never thought of it. Or maybe it was the mere phenomenon of this man week after week after week coming to counsel. What's going on with his life? This is what he's doing. That's important input to what's happening in our community. This is where we are with the homeless community. So all of it's valuable. It doesn't matter who it is, doesn't matter what it is, there's value. We need to have the attitude that the input is valuable. And that we always have an incomplete picture. As Michelle was just saying, I don't see it all, you don't see it all, your entire city staff doesn't see it all, the entire council doesn't see it all. We're never going to see it all. You could do a perfect, scientific, sampled survey, excellent, do it all right. You still don't have the full picture. You could talk to every citizen in your community, and you still would not have a complete picture, because there are people who aren't citizens, because the citizens are answering the questions you asked and not answering the questions you didn't ask. There's no way to have the picture be complete. So we always need to be seeking input. And importantly, we're arguing every member of the government team has a role in this input process. It doesn't matter who you are. You may never deal directly with the public. You may be in a back office handling the spreadsheets for particular departments, and that's really all you do. That's really important. You have something to offer. And because that's your perspective, you will hear things that other people are saying differently. Every member of the team has a role in helping to bring in input, helping to process it. This doesn't belong to your communication officer. It belongs to everybody. However, elected officials have a particular responsibility for this, because that's their job. Fundamentally, the council members, the mayor, the commissioners, whatever title they have, they got elected saying they were going to represent the people, and they can't represent the people if they're not listening. And if they don't realize that they need to keep getting out there and listening, they're never going to get it. So, my question just quickly, because I didn't see any. Any elected officials in the room this morning? Raise your hand. Of course. Madam President, of course. Anyone else? Okay, so this is a message for you to be thinking about how you can help your elected officials do their job better, because they're the ones who can go out and assemble public opinion on certain issues, and they need help to do it well. They need information presented to them in ways that they can use it, so they can help mobilize constituencies to get the good work done, engaging stakeholders. That's their job especially. But they need help to do it well. And that's a role that you all can play in helping them do it. Taking in input, capture it. Have a mechanism. Think about how you can make sure that all the input gets captured and none of it gets lost, and all of it gets shared in a meaningful way. That doesn't mean everybody needs everything that everybody gave, but you've got to have a way, if you're going to do all this, to make sure you don't lose it, and that it gets to the people who need it. That's a process that some of us haven't really developed very well. Then use it. Used to be, I work in transportation a lot as well, used to be when there was a major transportation project, road, bridge, whatever, they would hold these public hearings or public workshops, and you'd go to a gymnasium someplace and there'd be all of these multicolored diagrams and maps and artist renderings of what it's going to look like and the different profiles and all that stuff, and there'd be people standing at the different posters answering your questions, talking to you, and then over in one part of the gym there'd be a table. And at the table there were sometimes stenographers or court reporters, so you could give them your comments and they would type it up right on the spot. Sometimes it's computers and you can answer a survey and then give open-ended responses to questions. Sometimes it's paper and pencil. You fill out your responses and you put them in a box. But they collected our input. And then when the plan came out, totally unchanged, all of that input was in an appendix at the back. It said, yeah, we took input, and we put it in the appendix. What do you do with an appendix? You take it out. Doesn't do any good. That's the way we used to do it. That is not meaningful input. That's window dressing. Thank goodness we don't do that anymore. We shouldn't do that. We should use what we learned from the input, and we should show them that we used it. So when you roll out the budget, you should be saying, last spring, these things happened. We heard from citizens. This is what we're doing. We're making these changes in response to what we heard. Many of our communities drowned with the tropical storm and the heavy rain we've gotten. Just the rest of the country's in a drought and we're drowning. Well, citizens are talking to us and we're seeing new things in businesses because of what's happened, and it may mean we're making some changes. Tell them that's why we're doing it. We heard you. Here's our response. Michelle has a great story about that she's going to talk about later. It's not always a big thing in terms of the budget, but it may be a big thing in terms of communicating that we are listening, that we care. So here's the bottom line on the input side. As a budget message, keep listening all the time, because listening is what our citizens want to hear. If we listen, they know we care. Okay? Take a moment for any question you might have, and then we're going to move right into the output side. In a little bit, we'll take a break. So is there a quick question, something? All right. I'm going to let Michelle take over.
Michelle, before you do, I want to remind everybody that we do have questionnaires here. If you have any questions that you want to ask our presenters as it relates to this topic, just write them here and provide that information to Michelle, and I will take these up and they can answer your questions at lunchtime or Suzanne.
Okay, so Scott's talked to you about the importance of input. And I think we all know that at heart, but sometimes it's kind of hard, because particularly if you're the staff person, and I think we're mostly, as Scott said, mostly staff, there is sometimes the sense that, yeah, but we know best, right? We've dealt with this. But because we serve the public, there is definitely that obligation to get input. So you get the input, but then the question is, so what are we going to do with it? Well, we're going to focus on this part about how do you shape the message that you take out so that people are willing to listen to what you have to say, which is kind of hard when you're talking about the budget. When you go back and tell all your teammates, I am ready to go out and talk to the public about the budget, the first thing they're going to say is, and why will they care? Because budget, I mean, the fact that you guys are here is exciting, because, really? You tell people I'm going to a training session on communicating my budget, and people would probably say, boy, I'm glad I'm not there. Right? Because budget comes with that kind of idea that it's not very interesting. So you've got to help shape that conversation, and we're going to talk about that. There's a person that I'll quote every now and then. His name is Vincent Cavello. He's with the Center for Risk Communication. And he is an expert at saying there are ways to communicate that really are quite scientific. He says that you can build your confidence by anticipating, by preparing, and then by practicing how you deliver that message. And I think those of us who've been in government for a while, we get a little comfortable with what we're doing and we think we're pretty good at it. And sometimes we have to stop and think, are we really conveying it well? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about understanding and identifying key messages, and I really want you to focus in on this, because when we do the afternoon exercises, you all at your tables are going to be defining your key messages for your scenario city that you're then going to be presenting. And you're going to have a lot of fun with this, so we'll focus a lot on key messages. And we're going to talk about how do you stay on message, and to the best extent possible, how do you stay in control? Because we've all been to meetings where that one person stands up and tries to get the microphone and wants to go on and take control of that meeting. So we'll touch on that as well. We also want you to feel comfortable that you're an effective person at communicating your message to the public. And we're going to talk about that as well. So key steps in preparing, I want you to think about these three things. You should be able to anticipate what people are going to ask you about. So when you go and stand in front of an audience and they are mad as hell about X, are you surprised? Right? You know what people are going to complain about. You've been there long enough. You've heard things. So you have to anticipate and be ready for what's going to come. And that means you have to have a plan. It's not okay to just go off the cuff. Not with the media, not with a citizen group, not one-on-one sometimes. You need to be thinking about, what am I trying to convey? And so we're going to talk a lot about planning, and then we're going to talk about practice. You get better the more you do it, so we'll touch on that as well. Oops, pointed the right thing here. Okay, anticipate and plan. First thing I want you to think about when you're going to talk to a citizen group or to anybody is, what's the purpose of why I'm there? Now, if you're an elected official, what would be the purpose of an elected official for talking to the public about the budget? Why would an elected official want to do that? Gather input. Sometimes it's because they want to get reelected. Or some of y'all in the primary season, they want to be out and talk about what we've accomplished. They want to be out and saying, I'm in touch with you. How about as far as those of us that are in city government? What do we want to accomplish? When you go out and talk to a group, what do you want to accomplish when you leave that group? You want their buy-in. You know, part of it is, selfishly, we really don't want to have 8,000 people show up at the commission public hearing. And so if we can convey what we're doing and we get enough input, maybe we're not going to have just angry people at the public hearing. Then we still may have some, but you may help mitigate some of that, where people either say, you know what, I hadn't thought about that perspective. So we may be trying to get buy-in, we may be trying to help convey the message to our audience. I always want to think about, what do we want to accomplish? When we have elected people in the groups, one of the things that we've said to them is, as an elected leader, you can say to people, and sometimes even we as staff can, people say, you know what, I love what you guys are doing with the Parks and Recreation program. What can I do to make sure there is support for that? You, as an elected leader, you can easily say, write a letter to the editor. Come to a public hearing. Come to a meeting. Write a my view. I think sometimes we think, well, we can't ask people that. Well, if they ask, how do we help? Why don't we help them understand how they can communicate? Because when you see, I mean, how many of you see those letters to the editor and it's positive and you want to cut it out and frame it? Have you seen those? If somebody says, boy, the city's doing a great job. But for every one of those ones that say you're doing a great job, how many are there that complain about something, right? Because people are more likely to complain. So let's figure out, how do we also help our citizens? If they say, I love what you're doing, then say, share it. If you're elected leaders, send out a newsletter. Let them say, we're in the process of working on this. If you like something, let us know. We don't think about that. We always say, hey, if you're happy, I'm glad to hear from you. Encourage them to share that story because it makes a difference. Who's your target audience? Now, in government, lots of times we ask that question and people say, the public. It's really not the public as a great big group. If you're going to talk to the Kiwanis, what are they going to talk about? What do they care about? Everybody have a Kiwanis club in their community?
Rotary.
What are they going to talk about?
Well, we've done the budget presentation to Rotary and Kiwanis.
Okay, and what do they care about? What are the issues they want to know about?
Well, we hit on the stakeholders. How is it going to impact their individual tax bills? How many times are we going to mow the median in front of their house?
Okay.
Are the trees dead outside in the median?
Okay.
And are we repaving their streets?
So most of those things you just talked about, those people are homeowners, right? Most of them want to talk about, what are you doing for me in front of my house with my property values, the maintenance, the streets, because a lot of people at the Kiwanis Club are going to be homeowners. In Tallahassee, we have 50,000 college students. If I'm talking to a group of college students, do they care one iota about property taxes? No. What do they want to talk about? The party patrol that the police department has and why they're so tough on the students. But they also sometimes want to talk about safety. They want to talk about, hey, we're worried about crossing Tennessee Street because we think we're going to get run over. There are issues depending upon who the audience is. So don't write your budget presentation and make it one size fits all. If I'm talking to the Rotary Club, think about who's in the club. Think about what their issues are. If you're going to go talk to the Chamber of Commerce, what are they going to care about? Are you making life that easy for me as a business? What are we doing to promote new businesses? What are you doing to help my business grow? You have to tailor your message to the audience that you're talking to. And then think about what format works best. And I do think we've all kind of gone to the, we're going to have an open house. We're going to let you just come in because that way nobody gets the mic, right, and rules the meeting. But I'm not sure that public meetings are always the best way to do it. What about, it's a lot of work, but how many of y'all have neighborhood associations, right? Some in bigger communities, you might have 100, 200 neighborhood associations. In smaller communities, you may only have 4 or 5. And maybe if you go to them, only 10 people come. But those 10 people become advocates for your message. And they tell 10 more people, oh, yeah, I couldn't believe city manager came and sat down in my house. We just had a neighborhood meeting here at the house. And this is the message that got out. So you don't have to always figure out how you reach 8 million people. All you have to sometimes do is reach 1%, and that 1% can tell that story. If you guys are going to go have a public meeting, where do you usually like to have the public meeting? Where?
City Hall.
City Hall.
You know, particularly budget, we've done it in churches and literally in the pews, the choir pews, which is always fun. We take it out to the neighborhood.
I think there's a real advantage of doing that. Even though we say City Hall is the hall of the people, do people really feel like that? Why do they come to City Hall? Usually it's to pay something or to complain about something. So if I was going to have a budget meeting, I don't think I'd want to have it at City Hall. I love to go to a church. Why is a church a great place to have a meeting? You ever thought about that? Why is a church a good place? The fellowship hall at the church.
People don't misbehave as much.
I agree. You know what? If you're going to get cursed out, do you think they might not curse you out in the fellowship hall of the church? Okay, they might still, but people behave a little bit differently when it's a place of worship. So think about going to a place of worship, but make sure it's got easy parking. Make it in the neighborhood. Go to a community center, a place that people come to already, instead of making them come to what they think is the ivory tower of City Hall. So it's about going back out to them. Think about what format works best. The other thing I would say is that sometimes you don't need to be having meetings at all. Sometimes it can be email communication. With a city government, every opportunity you have to engage with a customer, you ought to ask them, can we get your email address? Would you like us to send you updates? Now, you always provide them a way to opt out if they get tired of your updates. But if you're doing stuff on the budget, and I get an email that says, hey, we're trying to look at some of these priorities, can you send us back some information that tells us what you think about this? But what Scott said, really? You're asking for my input? It doesn't have to be scientific. A quick example of one of the things we did in Tallahassee. It's really hard to get people excited about budget. But we started this last year, and we took the commission priorities for the year, and we identified them on these poster boards, and then we put examples of what those things were on poster boards. We went to 4 different meetings throughout the community, and when people came in, yes, we had the kind of obligatory, this is how your budget works. Probably not the best thing because this is capital, this is enterprise. Nobody really kind of relates to that. But we did the little overview. But the part people liked is, then we gave them dots. Yep, the green and red dots. And we said, go around the room, and the things that are priorities to you, put a green dot on. And the things that you might be able to live without, put a red dot on. Some people, the best part of this is people who thought they might lose something in the budget process, they galvanized the troops. So the Arts Council said, we need to be there and support the arts. And the soccer folks, I don't want to lose a soccer field. Be sure we're there talking about soccer. It was the best thing from a staff perspective because the people we usually hear from are the same 4 that come to every commission meeting. And they are so annoying, right? It's their right. We appreciate them. Scott's homeless guy, it's his right to get to stand up there. But when you hear it meeting after meeting, it kind of beats you down. And all they complain about is how bad the city is. So when we had these meetings, we had people coming up to the boards and saying, I just got to tell you, the coaches you guys have doing the soccer program are fantastic. And thank you, city, for doing that training program so you taught the parents how to be good coaches. We don't always hear that. So at every table they were voting. Did we get a lot of people there? We did this for 4 different meetings. We put it on the internet, and I think we got a total of 5,000, something along that line, people who took part either in attending or voting, more online than in person. Tallahassee's a community of 180,000 people. Is that representative of everybody in the government? Absolutely not. But for the people who came, they had a say in what we were doing. And what Scott says is, well, do you come back and share the stories then of what you did differently? One thing that came up at those meetings was people voted heavily that they wanted community gardens. We had no money in the budget for community gardens. And so the commission said, you know what, let's put $20,000 to helping pay the water expense to help promote more community gardens. Of course, we love policy, so we had to do a policy about putting it on city land and, what are all the rules about it. But we put in place this program. So this year when we went back, we said, does it make a difference? Look, this year we have $20,000 for community gardens, and we had people saying, I love what you've done with this community garden. Now the truth is, people don't talk about the $20 million you're spending on sewage treatment, right? Because they don't really relate to that. But they loved what we did with community gardens. And they said, you know what, my attending that meeting made a difference. So you can find ways to share that story. Okay, we talked about those. I want to talk a little bit about frame. And frame, again, by a definition, there is a person named George Lakoff. Have any of you heard of George Lakoff? He's worth looking up. He's an interesting person. He's actually a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, I think. And he's very political. But if you listen to what he describes, he talks about that a frame is the value-based structures that shape the way we see the world. So kind of what you see depends upon where you stand. But what he also says is that words make a huge difference. So when you talk about words, language activates frames. So if I'm going to go out to a budget meeting and I'm going to say, what are you willing to give up? How does that hit you? Why do I have to give up anything? What are you willing to give up? I think you have a car allowance, don't you? Why don't you give up your car allowance? The frame you've created by giving up is something that's already put me in a certain mind frame. That's where I'm coming from. If I say, Scott is a really warm person, what does that evoke with you? You have this idea of, well, he's a nice guy. There are words, and how we use them really makes a difference. In the classes we've taught, I've talked about, if you say, I'm here to talk to you about ad valorem taxes, I want to talk about infrastructure, and I want to talk about the enterprise budgets. What'd you say? Right? Enterprise, oh, isn't that Star Trek, one of those ships things? We don't think about how we convey the message. And so when your message is, I care about what you have to say, suddenly that kind of changes how we're looking at things. I want to give you a few examples of kind of some positive frames versus some negative frames. My favorite one is Richard Nixon. Everybody remember Richard Nixon? What did he say? I am not a crook. What'd you hear him saying? I'm a crook. So when you come out and you say, your first statement when you stand up in front of a crowd is, I am not here to raise your taxes. What do they hear you say? I'm raising your taxes. So the frame of how you use words is going to evoke a different reaction from the audience. George Lakoff writes and says, if you tell people, don't think of an elephant. I don't want anybody in this room to think of an elephant. How many of you are thinking of the trunk and those big legs? So telling people what not to think of is going to make them think of that. So consciously planning your message and the frame you want to have is going to make a big difference. A great example, pro-choice and pro-life. Now again, it doesn't matter where you are on these issues. If I am pro-life, who is not going to be for life? I mean, what was it? If I'm not pro-life, then I'm pro-death? Yes, of course I'm pro-life. Well, what about pro-choice? Do you want to not have a choice? So So do you see how they've used those words on both sides of the arguments to frame how you look at the situation? Now, one thing I want you to be careful that you don't hear me saying is, I'm not saying you're going to manipulate your audience. That is not the intent, because they will see right through it. And sometimes words are used to try to manipulate an audience. I want you to try to use your words to convey your sincerity. So shaping a message that's not sincere is not going to work. It's got to be the message you want to send that's sincere, but how you say it is going to make a big difference. Another George Bush one. I don't know why we're picking on President Bush today, but this is the son. He said, "We do not need a permission slip to defend America." What image does that evoke in your mind when you hear that? What's that? Parents, right. Permission slip. Where do you get a permission slip? School. I think it's like getting to go to the bathroom, right? I don't have to have a permission slip to go to the bathroom. He's saying, I don't need a permission slip to defend America. What if he said instead, I am pro-war? How does that hit you? What's the difference? One evokes a different reaction because of how he uses the words. So in government, we have to think about that. So let me ask you, when people think about city government, what words do they use? What's the frame? When you say, I'm from the government, how do people react? What's the words they hear? Tax what? Tax collection. You're here to take my money. Okay, what other words? Bureaucracy. Fat cat bureaucrat from City Hall. Right? That's what we think. I mean, you hear those words. What other words come from within you think of city government? Dysfunctional. They fight all the time, don't they? Those elected leaders, they fight with the county. They're worse than the dysfunctional family. Did y'all see the news of the poor Jackson family today? I don't know what's going on. You know, when you live in the public light, now they have to argue about where's mom and where's she going. They have this whole dysfunctional sense of what's happening. That's what people think of city government. Do they think we're effective, efficient, positive? Not so much. So what I'm saying is when you come into the room and they're starting out with these things about they're dysfunctional, they're fat cat bureaucrats, are we here to help? You know, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Do people, that's not a positive statement, right? People hear that and they think you're really here to screw me over. You're just saying you're here to help. So if that's the frame that people have when you come to deliver your budget message, how do you change that? We're going to talk about that. Your budget frame needs to be the stuff that Scott talked about initially too. This is your community and we want you to help shape it. Now, I pulled this from something else that was listed and it said taxes are membership dues that we pay to create the community we want. I think I might change that a little bit because membership dues implies what? When you hear the word membership dues, what do you think of?
Voluntary.
What's that?
It's voluntary.
Voluntary? I think sometimes of membership dues being like if I'm paying membership dues, that's maybe the country club. And I don't want to come across as being a country club city manager or city spokesperson. So, but I do think you want to create the connection. So when the first thing you say to the public is, we're facing some really, really tough choices right now. And as someone who lives in this community, I'm worried about us being able to sweep the streets more often. We're worried about making sure that we landscape the medians enough that you think it's pretty and we attract visitors who think this is a beautiful city. And worse than that, we're worried about what's happening with public safety because our response times in the police department have gone down. And we're worried about that. And that's why we're here to talk to you to find out what's important to you to help us prioritize the budget. That will change how they're looking at what you're saying because now you're part of that message. You're part of the conversation. I live here. And if you see the words I use, doesn't it go back to what Scott said at the beginning? I care. The fact that I live in this community and I'm here to talk to you is because I care about what my kids experience in these neighborhoods as well. So making it a personal message when you try to talk about it. And our budget is how we, the citizens of this city, take care of the community. And that's what our conversation is about. So it's really hard when you're factual and you're all logical and you're trying to get people to hear that you care. Yes, ma'am.
On the how you frame it, what if the issues that you're trying to frame are, we can't do all of these things no matter how meritorious they are?
The question.
And what you want to know is from the citizens, the question that you didn't want to ask,
What do you
the
want
way
to
you
hear?
asked it is, what are you going to give us? What do you want us to stop doing since you are unwilling to pay more? And that's, to me, been the nexus of the message. That's the true message. How you frame it to where it sounds better than that. It's not a good message to begin with. But I think I see a lot of cities and a lot of city managers continuing to try to say, well, we still have to do all these things. So I'm going to convince you to just pay more because we still have to do all these things. And I think the message I'm hearing when I see what's going on is people are saying they don't want to pay more. But no one is willing to say what they are willing to stop doing. And that includes the elected officials who, by the way, may not be real happy with you going out and asking the citizens what they want or explaining the budget or promoting the budget because they may not agree about it. So that's, to me, been the
hard part.
My feet have hit the fire every year, which is the message is, no, we can't do all these things. We can't continue to do all these things. No matter how beneficial, no matter how logical, no matter, something's got to give. And so things like community gardens may be that thing.
And just to catch the question before you had the mic. So the basic point here is, what do you do when the message is, we can't do all of these things that you are expecting us to do? How do you frame that as something that engages the public in a more constructive way?
Right, and there were a whole lot of messages and questions in that. I think that is a tough issue, but I think if you're realistic about the message and you don't frame it as giving up, but more about prioritizing. And it's the same thing, but saying, when we did those dots, sometimes people said, you know what, I'm not really all hip on us building a new senior center. We don't have enough money to do that now, so that needs to wait. So when you say that, I think you can say realistically, here's how much money we have, and here's where the property values have come in. We didn't make this number up. The state has told us we're going to get this much from sales tax, and it's down 7% from last year. And on property values, they're stabilizing some, but we're still facing a 3% reduction. So here's the amount of money we have, and we have some tough choices to make. And we can't do it all, but we need you to help us prioritize. I do think it sends a different message, and I think there is a challenge, though, because some of your elected leaders say, of course you can do it all. Of course you can. And I think you've got to be realistic with people. And it's not about saying we don't want to. We want to provide the services that are most important to you. And we're asking you to help us do that. And the hardest part of that is there's not an answer. Because what you want, I don't play golf. I really don't care that we have city golf courses, but we have a whole group of people who love golf. And so I think, again, being realistic, saying to them up front, your input is going to make a difference, and let me show you how. And I would fight to the tooth and nail for that $20,000 for community gardens, because in the city's huge budget, it really is minuscule, but the value of saying we listened to what you said is really important. So if you hear from people that a big issue is you're not sweeping our streets, we did that in Tallahassee. We said that's going to be something we can cut back on. Instead of doing it once a month, we're going to come back, and on the residential streets, we're doing it once a quarter. Well, guess what kind of feedback we got? You've made this look like a trash place. It's terrible. Our streets are horrible. And what we said the next year was, we implemented that, and we heard back that people hated it. And we can't do it all, but here are the choices we're looking at this year. We can increase this, but we're going to have to make a change over here. Right now, we're going through that in Tallahassee. We have an arts and crafts center that does a great job. But when we evaluate it, we can show you that the cost per participant for that center is higher than just about any other program we do. And so our message is, we love this. My kids have gone to that art and crafts center. It's marvelous. But that's one of the things we've put on the block, not because we don't love it, but because the cost per participant is higher than any other program we offer through our parks. And if we want to keep doing it, let's look at, are there different ways to do it, or is that something that can slip off? And people have said, well, I don't even know why you put that up. That's like closing the Washington Monument. Well, not really. So how do you balance those things? So I think you're right, but I think the words you use, it has a reaction on how people respond. So if you're saying, I care, it's tough choices, how do we prioritize, they may approach it differently than if you say, we don't have enough money and we can't do everything, so what are you going to give up? Because already my back is up and I don't like having the conversation because it's win and lose as opposed to working together.
Jump in for just a second. I want to take you off the track. Speaking on the elected official side, former elected officials. We know people run for public office for a variety of reasons. Some of them are very public service oriented, some not so much. But in most communities there are at least some who are, because it doesn't pay enough otherwise and there just isn't enough prestige in being councilman. But often what happens, given the difficulties of understanding the budget, is that public officials who are elected are required to defend something they don't understand. As a practical matter, they don't actually know, do we really not have the money to do this? And we have a public that assumes we're fat crap bureaucrats and we're wasting their money. So I think for those who are not elected, one of the messages is your elected officials will perform better on average if they have the informational tools to speak the truth clearly and simply. How many of the things we do in the budget process empower our elected officials that way? And my answer is probably not a lot of them, for a variety of reasons. I mean, it can be risky to a city manager. I know. I would never take a city manager's job. Toughest job in the world as far as I'm concerned in public service, because it's political and it's professional both. A city manager who says, here are the numbers, here's the reality, this is what we've got. You want this, that's what it costs. This is what we have. They don't match. Tell me what you want to do. That person may get fired. But the next person coming in is going to face the same reality. And sooner or later, we got to deal with reality. So I think some, not all, elected officials, but certainly some, simply need the tools. They need the information, clear and concise, that they can communicate as part of the budget message. Saying, here are the choices we face. Our revenue is down 7%. Our costs are up 3%. You can do the math in your own home. We can do it in the city, running the same way. We can't do what we were doing with less money. How do we prioritize becomes the question, and then developing methods to help the citizens engage that. There are a variety of tools out there for helping give the citizens an opportunity to say, well, if you got to prioritize, the dots, here's the budget broken down in percentages roughly, how do you want to see it divided up? You have to do that intelligently, because they'll say they don't want anything for support staff, because they don't realize that you have to have support staff, so you build that in. But
and building on that, I would tell you, how many of us say, oh, I put the budget online. The entire recommended budget is online. Okay, really? I mean, we do that. We have to do that. But how many people read the entire recommended budget online? I mean, I'm sorry for those of you who prepare it, but it's really just not easy reading. So for your elected officials, create a fact sheet. They don't want to be told these are speaking points, because now you're shaping the message. But you really are trying to help them shape the message and say, here are the issues. And give them a fact sheet with bullets that are written in language that people can understand, so that when they go out, they may choose to ignore it, but if they choose to, they can use those same information. So you don't try to make it too shaped, but kind of just, here's the information that's important. Okay, so quickly, the real input here, and we're going to take a break in just about 2 minutes. It's when you talk about budget, your words do matter. And there's a lot of words that make people respond to you positively. The care message works. You need to talk about being balanced, being fair, being equitable, dealing with tough choices. All of those things make people a part of the conversation, as opposed to saying, I'm the winner and you're going to be the loser, which is how they tend to come look at the budget. So we're going to talk more, and we'll look at it this afternoon when you do your budget exercises about frame. But I want you to not start off saying all of those buzzwords that shut me down. When you present your budget this afternoon, tell me something that touches me, that lets me know you care about the community and that you're sincere about trying to get my involvement.